Hey, it's Frank here with 4D Honeybee, and I just want to talk about a few things that are important to do and not to do in the spring. I think this is ideally for relatively new beekeepers, particularly maybe heading into year 2 of beekeeping when you've overwintered some bees. They're starting to emerge in the spring, and there are some things that you really have to do or should do just to make sure the colony is going to survive. And I speak from experience because I've done about 6 or 7 years of beekeeping, overwintered bees in the cold Canadian climate. So if you get doing these things very early on, you really increase the likelihood that your bees will survive. So thanks for joining me on 4D Honeybee. Okay, first and foremost, important thing to do is to check for a queen. And I maybe should correct that. Not check for a queen, but check for a right laying queen. So particularly beginner beekeepers are really focused on finding the queen. And it's difficult to do unless she's marked in those beginning years. It took me a good 4 or 5 years before I came good at spotting the queen. But again, what you're doing here is not so much checking for a queen, but checking for a right laying queen. In other words, checking that that queen is laying brood, lots of brood in a good pattern, and the hive is producing new worker bees. Sometimes you'll have a look in the spring and you'll find the queen and get all happy, but then you'll see that there's not that much brood in the hive, and you've got to take action on that. Don't wait too long. That's something I'm guilty of. You see the queen, the brood pattern's not great. There's not that many bees in the hive, and you give her a couple of weeks, and you give her a couple of more weeks, and there are things you can do. If you add a couple brood frames to the and eggs to the hive, it can help the bees decide what to do. So they may start to make a supersedure cell to make a new queen, or it might be that the queen just needs a kickstart, and that will help. But sometimes it doesn't work, and you have to make a decision early on to pinch the queen and requeen the hive. And again, better to make that decision in April than to be getting into June, July and realizing that your hive is continuing to struggle. So number one, right laying queen. Make sure your queen is laying eggs and laying eggs in a good pattern. Number two is feed. Feed those bees. Now in this climate, usually bees can start flying in March, and I always try to feed the bees in early March. Take that first day when your temperature gets to or above 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and get some food in those hives. I lost 2 hives that were doing great at the beginning of March, but were dead by the end of March because I didn't feed them. So that's an automatic now. I will always feed the hives first chance I get in March. If you get a couple warm days in February, feed them in February. Why not? The thing you want to try and do when you're feeding that early is try, if at all possible, not to feed in liquid form. If you can feed pollen, if you can feed a pollen honey mixture, if you can feed any kind of solids, that's preferable, because again, introduction of moisture to hives in the winter or in the late winter or early spring can be a real problem. Now, one thing I'm not crazy about, and I might get some heat for this, but I'm going to say it anyways, are those entrance feeders. Entrance feeders are a real invitation for robbing. And although early spring isn't really a robbing season, if you start off with a weak hive or a hive that's struggling with disease or struggling with low resources or low numbers of bees, when you put that feeder at the entrance, it's an invitation for all bees, all yellow jackets, every form of critter to come to that hive and start robbing. So preferably internal feeding, preferably dry feeding. Even if you just have to pour sugar on tops of frames, that's better than not feeding in March, in the spring. The other thing you should do, it doesn't hurt, is to reduce the hive entrance. If you put a hive reducer on, it just makes it a lot easier for that colony to defend that entrance, and it doesn't bother them at all. They'll get their way in and out, no problem. But again, defending a space that's 1 inch is a lot easier than defending a space that's 16 inches. So just keep that in mind. Reduce entrances pretty much as a standard always when you feed. Next most important thing, treat for mites. Particularly, again, in my area at least, mites are the biggest vermin issue with these bees. We haven't seen much hive beetles, although that may change with our mild winters. Hive beetles don't do well in the cold, but mites are a big problem. Now, what I used to do is I used to test for mites, And I found that an interesting practice, and I did find mites in my colony. But really, it's not a question of if you have mites or how many mites you have. You definitely have mites, and you should treat for mites. You should consider it that way. So it's fine if you want to do a test. There's lots of good ways to do it. I've got a video here that shows how I did it, and it was phenomenally accurate. When you fill up the line of that container with the number of bees it indicates, I then counted the individual bees afterwards, and it was absolutely bang on, almost to the bee. So you get a really good, accurate count, but it really doesn't matter what the count is. Just treat for mites. Treat in the spring. And if you want to check in the midsummer to see how your mite counts are doing, that's probably a good time to do a mite count when colonies are very strong. You know where your queen is. You take a bunch of bees off of the brood and off of the larva and eggs. That's where mites are most prominent. And you do a test there. And if you see you have any number of mites, you could do maybe a mid-season mite treatment in the summer as well. But for sure, spring and fall, you have to treat for mites. No doubt about it. So number 4, and probably the last one, is make space for those bees. If you got a good strong hive emerging in March and April, they're going to need room pretty quick. If you've got 4 or 5 or 6 layers of brood that's hatching out, that's a lot of bees. Once you get to about 7 or 8 frames being covered by bees, you need to give them more space. And there's basically 2 ways you can give them more space. You can add supers. You can add supers for honey. You can add another brood box. You can move brood boxes or brood frames from the bottom up to a top brood box and kind of mix them around that way. Or you could do a split. Depending on what your plan is for your bees, splitting a hive does 2 things. It obviously increases your colony size, diversifies your colony a bit, might even, depending on how you do it, might even diversify your genes and that kind of thing in the bees. And it makes the queen realize that she's got a lot of room to work with. So once you start spotting those supersedure cells or the swarm cells, you can split off them, but just make sure you give your queen lots of space to live in. And that way you'll reduce your chances to swarm. So those are the 5 most important things that I think you have to do, or make sure you don't do the opposite, I guess, in the spring. First off, make sure your queen is right laying. Finding the queen is great. Knowing that she's laying good patterns is more important. If she's not, take action. Number 2, feed and reduce hive entrances. Preferably a dry feed in the spring. Don't increase the moisture content in that hive if you can avoid it. But whatever you can do, get food in there by March. Early March, not late March. That's too late. Treat for mites. Make sure you've got a regular treatment plan going. You can alternate that plan as well so that they don't build up a resistance to it. That's something you can talk to a mentor or talk to a specialist about, but switch up your programs there for mite treatment, but do it at least 2 times, if not more, per summer. And make space. Either split or add boxes so that your queen has room and your queen is less likely to swarm. So those are the 4 things that I make sure I do. Really important, I think, for that second-year beekeeper that has gone through a season, made it through winter, and now needs to formulate a plan to help your bees survive. So hope that helps. If I've missed anything that you think is important, feel free to comment. If you like the video, feel free to subscribe, send me a comment. I love your questions, and I love interacting with everybody here at 4D Honeybee.